I think every man on the crew had already written themselves off. I think that we just gathered that if we get out of this one, it'll be beyond a miracle. I think we were just glad to still be alive. There wasn't a thing in the world we could have done that night. I just don't think Blackjack was meant to survive the war.
New Guinea is the world's second largest island, one of the last places to be explored or colonized. It is dominated by massive mountains which rise to peaks of over 13,000 feet, forming a jagged spine along the island. Within the interior are wide, fertile valleys, inland lakes, and countless rivers. There are no railways and few roads in a rugged land where in many ways time has stood still. The aeroplane opened up New Guinea. Jackson's airport lies 7 miles north of Port Moresby Township. It handles a constant stream of traffic, from the wide-bodied jets to the smallest planes operated by the feeder airlines, which fly in and out of the hundreds of airfields all over the country. Aircraft were first brought to New Guinea in the 1920s to transport the components of the huge dredges needed for alluvial gold mining, and from this developed an air transport operation of a size and scope unique in the world. All kinds of aircraft, old and new, provide the only effective means of movement within the country. But in 1942, Port Moresby was under siege, and this airfield was called 7 Mile. Port Moresby was the last Allied outpost in New Guinea. The invading Japanese had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains to capture it from the rear, and Moresby was under constant attack by enemy bombers. There was little warning, and by the time defending fighters got into the air, it was often too late. General Douglas MacArthur had come to Australia to command the Allied forces, and he believed that New Guinea could be held. To command his air forces, he chose General George Kenny, a brilliant, aggressive leader. It began as a desperate holding action. Every available aircraft went out in direct support of the men fighting in the jungles. Even Australian airliners were drafted to fly as unarmed transports, biscuit bombers, to drop supplies. The Japanese advance was halted, and after the recapture of Kokoda, the Australian and American forces began to take the initiative. If New Guinea was to be retaken, then Japanese attempts to reinforce their positions had to be blocked. In early March of 1943, a large convoy loaded with troops had left Rabaul and sailed for Lae, shadowed by Allied reconnaissance planes. In the morning of March 3, the ships were nearing the New Guinea coast, and every Allied plane which could fly was in the air, ready to strike. Australian Beaufighters went in first to suppress the guns on the Japanese ships. As flying fortresses passed overhead and bombed, Mitchell strafers dived to attack from mast height. The convoy was annihilated. Of 7,000 troops aboard the ships, less than 900 managed to reach the New Guinea shore. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea doomed Japanese hopes of conquest in New Guinea. New Guinea's experience had proved the value of aircraft in peacetime, and in wartime, control of the skies was critical. Kenny's airmen perfected a coordinated method of attack which had a grim rhythm and deadly efficiency. Lieutenant Ralph DeLoach first came to New Guinea late in 1942 as a co-pilot in an American Flying Fortress squadron. He flew many missions, both as a co-pilot and as an aircraft commander. These missions were flown in most of his squadron's planes, but one flight he would never forget was made in the B-17 named Blackjack. Ralph DeLoach was 24 years old when he left New Guinea. Now he was coming back.
When I left this part of the world, it never occurred to me that I'd ever come back again. About all I could remember was the bloody mosquitoes, which were as large as anything that I had ever imagined. And the dysentery, the heat, all the things that go with this part of the world. I was sleeping on a canvas cot with a mosquito net, and I think everybody else was doing the same, and under a tent if we were lucky. So it was primitive living. I find the place little changed. It's more modern, but the people are the same. And of course, 7 Mile Airstrip, which I got to know very well, is now the International Airport. And it has improved, but still it's recognizable. It has the old revetment still out there, with weeds having overgrown it. And I can well picture where we were stationed, or at least where our squadrons were up on the hilltops. It's a place of ghosts. It's something that happened long ago, and yet there it is. The remains are there. Those revetments did hold B-17s. And they did come out of their revetments, engines roaring, and they did their work, and they hopefully came home again. So it is. There's no other way to describe it. It has to be just a ghostly feeling. It's all gone. It's something of the past. This was a holding action. Now, they may have said otherwise, but we who flew down here felt that it was purely a holding action. And as a result, we got what was left over. The planes, in the early stages particularly, were in effect just being patched together. However, we were carrying a lot of petrol, a lot of fuel, and we were carrying a lot of bombs and a lot of men. And in the hot air, it just became a major problem trying to get them off the ground. And at that time, through many months, we sent out a number of airplanes that never be heard from again. I think the 63rd Squadron lost 3 in several months. They just went out, and that was the end of it. There was never another word. So there was stress and strain along that line. When crews would go out and never come back, and you'd never have any idea whether the cannibals had put them in their pots up in the highlands here going to Wewak, or whether the sharks had eaten them, or whether the Japanese had captured them.
From Port Moresby, Deloach travelled north across the Owen Stanleys, following a route which had once been so familiar. No pilot who flew in New Guinea could ever forget the late afternoon weather build-ups or the unforgiving terrain which lay below. Deloach's destination was Cape Vogel on the northeast coast. In July 1943, he had ditched a crippled bomber off these remote shores. 43 years later, that old plane had been found, just as he had left it, in 150 feet of water.
I was a pilot. A lot of the others are dead. You know, they just died of old age and time. But here am I, and you see these fellows have brought me here. Just so I could see you. How's that?
Rodney Pearce has dived the warm waters off Papua New Guinea for more than 20 years. With two other Australians, one-time patrol officer David Pennyfather and Bruce Johnson, a commercial pilot, Pearce combines his charter boat operation with a search for the forgotten remains of World War II aircraft and ships. His boat Barbarian is specially equipped for the task, and he had found many relics. But Christmas of 1986 was to be something special.
I think I started diving back in the late 50s, early 60s. I recall having a tank on my back at the age of 10. From there, this was in Rabaul, and from there we moved to Lae, where the conditions weren't the best. But I then went to school in Australia, finished my schooling, and was a very active diver. After leaving boarding school, I came back to New Guinea and took up this incredible passion of locating these wrecks. I think with all wrecks, a lot of luck goes a long way in finding them, a lot of research. The wrecks are scattered everywhere, from little bays, rivers, creeks, right out into the open water. This country absolutely abounds with them. And the war was fought here from 42, 43, right through to 45.
The war turned New Guinea into a vast wrecking yard. The Japanese Air Force was paralysed. The heavy bombers cratered their airstrips, and the low-flying strafers destroyed aircraft where they stood, beside the unusable runways. But the victory was not without cost. Hundreds of aircraft never returned. Others staggered back shot to pieces. The price was high, in planes and men. By August of 1944, the battle for New Guinea was over and the war moved on. toward Japan. Relics of the war still lie scattered all over New Guinea, most of them stripped for scrap or mangled beyond recognition. Sometimes an old plane will be brought out as a museum piece or a memorial, but hundreds more will never be found. They have become part of the jungle or seascape and will remain hidden forever, missing in action. Pearce and his friends had been told by villagers that a very large airplane had landed just off the coast near Cape Vogel. In December of 1986, they mounted an expedition to find it.
Bruce, you better have a look at those tables. 153 feet. And see what we've got there with a 20-minute bottom time.
So we plan on 20 minutes.
20-minute dive.
150.
150.
We'll call it 25 minutes. That's 2 at 30, 7 at 20, and 23 at 10. It's a lot.
Past the fringing coral reef, the water was up to 180 feet deep, and at that depth, where the pressure is 6 times greater than at the surface, there is little light, and the nitrogen building up in the bloodstream makes you dangerously lightheaded. The dangers are multiplied in an area as remote as Cape Vogel, where help is a very long way away if something goes wrong. Planning and teamwork are the only insurance.
On commencing our dive to search for the actual aircraft, I recollect that Bruce took the extreme left, David took the middle, and I took the extreme right. We swam down the reef. However, due to the extreme current in the area, somehow we all got stuffed up. And I really don't know what happened. However, I remember swimming down a ledge, and there was these beautiful sea wisps there. Depth of water then was about 130, 140 feet. And coming out of these sea wisps, I saw a shape that just didn't quite fit. I kept swimming, and then this monstrous tail. I knew it was an aircraft almost immediately. It was a magnificent sight, and it'll probably be a sight I will never forget, because I sort of distinctly remember seeing wingtip to wingtip, that the sheer size of it, and I knew exactly what it was as soon as I'd seen the tail.
The plane was a Boeing Flying Fortress, more than 70 feet long and over 100 feet across the wings. Her majestic tail rose nearly 20 feet from the white coral sand. The last Flying Fortress operations in New Guinea had been flown around October 1943, so the plane had been lying there for at least 43 years. All the characteristics of a ditching were there. When the plane hit, the water would have burst in the bomb bay doors and swept back through the fuselage. The gun turret in the belly would have been torn loose and forced upward, twisting the spine of the plane and buckling the skin. The radio room hatch was open. This was where the crew would have scrambled out to escape from the sinking plane. At the empty cockpit, both windows were slid open. Pearce's passion for these old wrecks had nearly cost him his life on several occasions. Finding the B-17 was the payoff and made up for other long, fruitless searches. The waste guns were gone from the side windows, thrown overboard because they could become lethal battering rams in a water landing. It was totally intact and had aged little in more than 40 years. Time had rotted away the fabric surfaces of the rudder, and the entire plane was cocooned in a light growth of coral and sponge. The twin machine guns still jutted from the tail turret and moved freely in their mounts. Running low on air, Pearce had only a little time to marvel at his discovery. More than 12,000 flying fortresses were built, most of them fighting in the air war over Europe. They flew from bases in England in vast formations up to 1,000 strong. The roar of their engines filled the sky as they assembled into squadrons, groups, and wings. Inside every B-17 there were 10 men. In the cockpit area, the 2 pilots and the flight engineer. In the nose of the aircraft were the navigator and bombardier. Midships was the radio operator. Behind him the ball turret gunner and the 2 waist gunners back to back. The 10th man was the tail turret gunner. The Flying Fortress was aptly named. She bristled with machine guns and had been chosen to prove that bombers could reach any target in daylight without fighter escort. The B-17 struck deep into Germany, running the gauntlet of enemy fighters. Bombing from 5 miles high, they helped carry the war to the enemy homeland long before an invasion could be mounted. More than 5,000 B-17s were lost in action, most of them over Europe. At the end of the war, the aerial armada had served its purpose, and the survivors were flown to vast desert graveyards. They were lined up wingtip to wingtip as far as the eye could see. Aircraft which had survived against all the odds could not escape the smelter's furnace. The B-17 off Cape Vogel was just one among 12,000. But which one? And how did it come to be there? At Cape Vogel, Ralph DeLoach was met by Rodney Pearce, and the final stage of his journey would begin next day aboard Barbarian.
David, how you doing, Ralph? How do you know? Oh, it's good to have you. Come aboard.
Thanks, kids, for listening. Okay, I'll see you soon. Right?
Bye. Thanks, boys.
A succession of small villages clings to the coastline in this remote corner of the Milne Bay province. The little communities are isolated, and canoes provide the only practical means of transport between them. 44 years earlier, Deloach's crippled bomber had broken clear of a tropical storm and landed in the water near the tiny village of Bogga Bogga.
I've thought of Bogga Bogga many, many times in my life since that wonderful reception we had the day we were picked up. We had no idea on this earth where we were. We came out of a totally black front. I think every man on the crew had already written themselves off. I think that we just gathered that if we get out of this one, it'll be beyond a miracle. But fortunately, at that precise point, we break out. There's this clear coast. The logic is that we should have flown into the sea and not probably been aware of it, just crashed into the sea, and then instead of finding an empty airplane, you'd have found a crushed airplane with 10 skeletons. That would have been the logic of the whole thing.
Deloach and his crew were the first Americans the villagers had ever seen. When the plane was first discovered, they had been apprehensive, fearing that its bombs might explode and destroy their reef, or that interfering with it might anger any spirits which had adopted it as their resting place.
Morning.
You have to go to the shore now.
Yeah.
All right, done.
All right. Bring it down.
Right.
It's good to see you. God, arranged very well. So have I. It's very good to see you. Very, very good. Thank you for having me. Absolutely done.
Only a handful of village elders actually remembered those few moments in 1943 when the plane hit the water, skipped like a stone, and disappeared. The stories of that day had developed an almost legendary quality. Now Deloach returned as living proof. pilot's visit gave enormous status to the people of Boga Boga among their neighbours. The old B-17 in the water was their plane, and Ralph DeLoach was their pilot. The military gives everything a number, men and machines. DeLoach's presence in New Guinea was the result of the recovery of this small brass plate from the cockpit of the sunken B-17. Production records showed that 124521 was accepted from Boeing's Seattle plant in July 1942. After last-minute modifications, she was flown to Australia, where she joined the 5th Air Force's 63rd Bombardment Squadron. Their war diary continued her story. The Flying Fortress was assigned to Captain Ken McCullough, a daring pilot whose exploits became a legend in the Southwest Pacific. McCullough was a flamboyant gambler, and the last two serial numbers of his new plane were 21. He named her Blackjack. McCullough's luck ran out, and he died in the fiery takeoff crash of another B-17. Blackjack was passed on to his old co-pilot, Harry Staley, and his crew. The Staley crew added their own personal touch, but the theme was the same. After Harry Staley completed his tour of duty, Blackjack was flown by nearly every pilot in the squadron. By the middle of 1943, she was a battle-scarred veteran. The war diary had shown the date she was lost and identified the pilot, Lieutenant DeLoach, and some of the crew. Blackjack had taken off a little after midnight to bomb Vuna Canal, biggest of the enemy airstrips at Rabaul. After taking off from Port Moresby, she flew a short distance to the south to circle and gain height before tackling the Owen Stanley Mountains. After the crossing, landfall was made at Kimby Bay on New Britain, and a straight course was set for Rabaul. About 30 minutes from the target, Blackjack developed serious engine problems, but the crew volunteered to keep going and complete the mission. After bombing, they headed for home across New Britain, with one engine vibrating so violently it threatened to tear itself from the wing, and the other engine on the same side, giving only limited power. They flew into a fierce tropical storm and became hopelessly lost in the blinding rain. At 5:45 in the morning, they radioed that they were here. When Blackjack had not returned by 11 o'clock, other B-17s were sent to look for the missing plane. They searched the ocean and coastline over a 50-mile area, but saw nothing. After 5 hours, they returned to Port Moresby to learn that the missing crew's location had already been reported. Blackjack had been ditched between Cape Vogel and Goodenough Island. 3 of the crew had been injured when she hit the water, but all 10 escaped from the sinking plane. Most of the crew had been bracing themselves in the radio room, using parachutes and seat cushions for protection. As soon as the plane stopped, they made their way through the overhead hatch and out onto the wing of the plane. In the cockpit, DeLoach was already in water up to his knees. Not wanting to risk being trapped in the bomb bay, he decided to go out through the window beside him. His flying suit was ripped from his body, but he made it. The plane stayed afloat for about 45 seconds, then sank quickly. Only one of the two life rafts had inflated, so the wounded were laid in it and the others clung to the sides. They were drifting out to sea in the current, but the villagers from Bogga Bogga paddled out in canoes and rescued them. 2 Australian spotters had heard the crash. They radioed for help, and Flying Officer Ronald Benithan had picked up the wounded men and flown them out shortly after. Another old document revealed that the 2 pilots had received the Silver Star for their actions that day, and that Deloach's wartime address had been St. Petersburg, Florida. Members of the family still lived there and were able to supply his current address in California.
On behalf of my people, we are very glad and have a pleasure mind with you today. Heading on, I would like to remind you that if my people here were bad people and savage people, you wouldn't come today. I think you would drown into the sea with your men, would be lying down there, decay and finish. But my people were good. They were kind and peaceful people. They saw you when you were young, but now you are gray-haired men. We'll say that you are old men now.
So I'm saying today that my life and all the men that were aboard that plane that night owe their lives to you. We were very lucky, more so in having you here than in putting the plane where we did in the water. And beyond that, I don't know how to say thank you, except that God bless you all. And thank you.
Ron Kona, thank you.
Inside the plane, time had stood still. Machine gun ammunition still lay in its belts on the twisted ball turret. Further forward in the radio room, there was more evidence that loose equipment had been jettisoned. Most of the radio gear was gone, but a receiver still rested on the collapsed remains of the radio operator's table. The local villagers had been unsure of exactly how many men had escaped from the sinking plane, but the war diary had confirmed that the wreck held no grim secrets. All that remained in the shattered nose was a machine gun, which would have been manned by the plane's bombardier. It was still firmly mounted in position. The damage to the plane made it obvious that it must have sunk nose first, hitting the seabed and then settling. The cockpit was separated from the radio room by the bomb bay. Determined to get in there, Bruce Johnson slipped off his air tank and buoyancy vest and steered them ahead of him. The bomb racks were a formidable barrier, and negotiating them was tricky. Slowly and carefully, Johnson inched forward. Outside, David Pennefather monitored his progress. Johnson emerged from the bomb bay under the top turret, just behind the pilot's armour-plated seats. Squeezing through the narrow opening, he became the first man to sit in the pilot's seat for more than 40 years. All the old instruments had disappeared beneath a veneer of coral, and the throttles and controls were locked by time.
I found this aeroplane particularly impressive. I'd never seen a B-17 before, and they're obviously such a good-looking aeroplane. There's an old adage, an aeroplane that looks good just about always flies well.
This wreck is by far and away the best air wreck that I've ever dived on. I would go out on a limb and say it's the best in the country, and I'll go out on a bigger limb and say you won't get a better air wreck anywhere in the world. For two reasons. A, its intactness, the actual, just how together it is, and secondly, and the magnificent war record of the aircraft. That was something we never knew when we found it. But we have since learnt that this aircraft has a war record absolutely second to none, totally outstanding, flown by magnificent pilots, with war records of their own, similar to that of the aircraft itself, which makes it just totally unique. Also, it is an isolated location, very isolated, very difficult to get to, and it is at a depth whereby we can hope that it'll be preserved for many, many years to come.
And I guess it was, I was lucky. I just happened to swim into it. And I'll never ever forget that sight.
Deloach stayed with the villagers for several days.
The village was as I had left it. really. And I had thought it would be before I arrived, and I suddenly realized it's exactly that. I suppose I just wondered if this was a dream, or did I actually leave California? Here I was coming back to something that I never thought I'd experience again. I never imagined a requirement bringing me back here. But they were apparently so grateful to have somebody from that crew that they'd rescued that cared enough to come back to the village and spend some time there. I don't know why they should be grateful to a bunch of airplane people who sat down in the water in front of their village, but they seem to be.
I remember because we were doing a lot of work in that general area. We'd fly from Port Moresby across the range, then come back into that area to bomb.
That was
Well,
B-17.
Yes, that was the B-17, Flying
B-17.
Fortress.
Oh, yeah.
The 4 engines,
4 engines.
and you had 10 men.
And
Right, yeah.
you were in it, you were the pilot.
I was the pilot.
You
Yes,
were
I was
pilot.
the one that came through the little window on the side because the plane was already filling with water. I had thought to put it on the reef, but it jumped over the reef.
Oh, yeah.
That's the reason it's where it is. Because what I remember...
They took Deloach to the exact spot where the bomber crew had been helped ashore in 1943. It had been very different then, with 3 men badly wounded, everybody cut, bruised and shaken, and still not knowing if they were in Japanese territory or not.
When I stand here today and think of 40-something years ago when all this happened, when my hair was dark instead of being white the way it is now, it made a difference. And the village hasn't changed.
Another thing the village elders clearly remembered was that they had been on their way to church that Sunday morning when the big plane roared overhead and crashed into the sea. Ralph Deloach had traveled 8,000 miles, and the old plane which had brought him here was now just 150 feet and 44 years away.
It is an eerie feeling to think that there it is intact, with parts of it still movable after 44 years. When I'm sure that there are a lot of airplanes between here and Ribal and here and Wewak and throughout the whole area, they're sitting at the bottom of the sea with the crew still in there. We had an awful lot of planes go out to bomb these various targets around here, and a lot of them did not come back. We lost quite a number, and we never knew what happened to them, whether it was weather, whether it was enemy action, or what could have happened. It was just one of those unknown things. There wasn't a thing in the world we could have done that night. I don't blame any member of the crew, whether it had been with me or some other crew. I just don't think Blackjack was meant to survive the war. And I think the way it's ended up now, sitting under the sea, being encrusted in coral, is one of the finest endings it could have had. It was a very proper ending for a very gallant aircraft.
On Blackjack's last mission, she was carrying a kind of made-up crew, and it was the first time that these 10 men had all flown together. The pilots were Lieutenant Ralph Deloach and Lieutenant Joseph Moore. Moore returned to the family farm in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, after the war. The bombardier was Lieutenant Herbert Diaz of San Francisco. Navigator, Lieutenant Charles Shaver from Lee, Massachusetts. The flight engineer and top turret gunner was Sergeant Delbert Smith the most seriously injured in the crash with a broken back. He lives in Rogers, Arkansas. The radio operator was Sergeant George Prezioso, who returned to his home in New Jersey. Sergeant Joseph Wilson from Philadelphia manned the ball turret. Corporal James Peterson of Mason City, Iowa, and Private Daniel Clinton from Brockton, Massachusetts, were at the waist guns. Clinton was flying his very first mission that night. The tail turret gunner was Sergeant Paul Blazewicz, now living in Florida.